Hello colleagues. The current state of the ecosystem of the Azov Sea is in ecological crisis due to the process of eutrophication. The depressed state of the reservoir has become as a consequence of the mass multiplication of microalgae of Cyanobacteria nodularia spumigena, dinophyte alga Lingulidinium polyedra and centric diatoms called water blooms and decreased water transparency. The process of water blooms was the result of intensive anthropogenic impact through nutrient inputs, radioactive and chemical contamination of water, dumping, and sand mining in the sea. The long-term suppression led to the death of most marine organisms. Changes in the marine ecosystem have disturbed the sustainability of inhabitants supporting the marine environment. There are numerical reductions in populations of most shelf dwellers due to a decline in the number of dominant organisms of benthic communities such as bivalve mollusks. In bivalvia populations, the visible morphological changes have manifested as a result of the process of metabolism in the body, leading to changes in growth rate, abundance, and distribution in the marine environment. The marine bivalve is Cerastoderma glaucum or lagoon cockle. A representative of the infauna of shallow sand sediments of the European coast. It belongs to the family Cardiidea. Its closest relative is sea idole, originally inhabiting the Mediterranean Sea. The diversion of sea glaucum from its nearest relative, sea idole, and its distribution along the European coast took place at the end of the Miocene and the beginning of the Pliocene. It entered the Sea of Azov in the Holocene after the connection of the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. The physiology and evolutionary development of the species allows sea glaucum to be tolerant to physical factors of D_errant marine ecosystems. The cockle's urahalinity of 5 to 38 and urothermicity 25 allows the species to expand and diversify its habitat. The cockle shell is found in lagoons, estuaries, deltas with partially saline areas, or in coastal marine shallows. This species is an inhabitant of shallow waters. The maximum depth of sea glaucum survival does not exceed 0.5 to 1 m. The depth of submergence depends on friability, tidal fluctuations of water, and hydrolytic regime. Silted sands and shells are characteristic of the Sea of Azov. The submergence of the cockle shell is 3/1 of the total body area. Life expectancy depends entirely on habitat. In most of the experimental work done, the age exceeds 6 years for some populations. In conditions with increased mortality and poor growth, the GUR can often be reduced to 2 to 3 years maximum. An analysis of morphometric traits was performed to reveal the patterns of morphological adaptations in sea glaucum populations in the D_errant areas of the Sea of Azov. Mollusk shells sampling was conducted in early June 2021 on the coast of the Sea of Azov. The average water temperature was 18.5. The material was collected at 5 sites, table. In this study we need to ND out what are the impacts now experienced by modern benthic communities at the head of the lagoon cockle. To do this, 14 morphometric features were selected for each sea glaucum, by which the condition of the species inhabiting the Sea of Azov will be evaluated. Measurements of the shell were made to an accuracy of 0.01 mm using a caliper. The investigated populations of sea glaucum had their own morphological features. The coefficient of variation of morphometric characteristics of the shell of sea glaucum in the Site 1 was in the range of 0.09 to 0.35%. The shell of the cockle shell of the Site 4 ranged from 0.07 to 0.43%. These small differences in values indicate similar conditions of the cockle shell populations. The smallest sizes were the cockle shells collected at Site 3 and Site 5. The coefficient of variation of Site 3 was in the range of 0.06 to 0.55%. The value, CV, for Site 5 was in the range of 0.09 to 0.32%. In the Site 2 population, the coefficient of variation ranged from 0.07 to 0.41%. The ratio of cockle shell sizes showed a trend of variation depending on the habitat. Analogous in appearance shells were found at sites 1, 3, and 5. The shells were rounded, the contour of the shells globularly swollen, the crowns wide, usually strongly protruding. The symmetry of the form of shells in a ratio of height to length was observed. The slightly elongated hind margin of shells of the sea glaucum. At the site 2 and 4 the shells also possessed strongly swollen roundish form. Asymmetry in relation to height to length and with more or less smoothed angles at the transition of dorsal margin to anterior and posterior. If there is an angle of posterior shoulder, it is usually equal. The SITE3 population differed from all other populations, showing the lowest values. The morphological distinction of the cockle shells in the Azov Sea was the arrangement of the ribs. The cross-section was shaped, of different height and length. Usually the flaps in the front part of the shell were found with rounded ribs in cross-section, in the middle trapezoidal, or in the second half of the middle part triangular with the triangular apex shifted to the lateral posterior facet. Most of the sample data on the number of ribs ranged between 17 and 27. The mean number of ribs was high for Site 1 populations, 21.19 plus or minus 0.29 having a relationship with shell size. Only Site 4 showed a similarly high number of shell ribs, table. Once again confirming the similarity of habitat conditions. The analysis of the histograms showed that the value of the index H, shell height, varies depending on the shell collection area. The highest index in the area of the Site 3, the lowest in the area of Site 5. In terms of the B/2 shell thickness, the values are off the charts at the site. The value L is the length of the shell, corresponding to the height. A slight elongation of the posterior end of the shell indicates the depth of burrowing into the ground. The normal location of the clam in the ground is 3/1 of the entire length of the shell of individuals. The highest values are at the Site 1 and 4. The index A, ligament length varies insignificantly compared to the variability of this trait. The dependence of ligament length as well as ligament shape on shell contour is practically not traced. The ligament length predominates in the largest individuals of Site 1 and 4, respectively. At the Site 3, the shortest shell ligaments were found, which belong to mollusks with abnormalities in the structure. The characters B, C, D, E, F, H, I, J correspond to the proportions of shells of mollusks. The number of ribs index, M, varied depending on the size and age peculiarities of cockles in individual study areas. Trait, L, hypothetical suggests that shell thickness indicates water salinity. The highest index at Site 1 was 1.03 plus or minus 0.05, figure. On the other hand, showed that low mean salinity negatively affects the growth of sea glaucum from the Baltic Sea. Described respectively isometric and positive relative growth in sea glaucum from several Mediterranean, Atlantic and Baltic sites. This wide variation in the relative growth of the species is certainly due to genotype, but also various local specific environmental factors can strongly influence the variations in shell shape present in bivalves. It is worth noting that the allometric growth of sea glaucum are a functional response to different habitat typologies. Thus, allometry was evident in Site 2 and 4. Indeed, bivalves are known for their remarkable morphological diversity and phenotypic plasticity, which is perceived as the main algorithm that allows organisms to survive under changing environmental conditions, especially for sea glaucum, which proved its ability to withstand extreme and unstable environmental conditions in different areas of the Azov Sea. Conclusion. During the morphological measurements of cockle shells of Cerastoderma glaucum in the 5 studied sites of the Sea of Azov revealed differences. According to the complex of morphological features, the most distinguishable were the size and allometric shape of the shell, its thickness, and the number of ribs. The result of the work showed that the most favorable conditions for the full development and life of cockles are the areas of sites 1 and 4 based on their size, and therefore the age of the mollusk. Although small deviations from the norm were observed. As for the rest of the study areas, the area is subject to constant natural fluctuations in the environment. From what was observed uneven morphological and physiological development of individuals, early mortality. The supposed hypothesis that eutrophication of the Sea of Azov affects the morphological development of cockles is not confirmed. For more exact statement, it is necessary in the further researches to carry out a number of researches connected with physiology of mollusk Cerastoderma glaucum.